For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sanel Lamini. Washington correspondent for the New York Times and author Ron Nixon discusses his latest book titled Selling Apartheid. Why do you think it was important for the apartheid government to win support and banish its image overseas?
Well, it was important for a number of reasons. One is that they were isolated here in the African continent. You've got all of these newly independent African countries surrounding them, and so they needed support. Plus, they were also outnumbered here. You know, they were a minority trying to control a majority, and so they went through these extraordinary means of trying to both suppress things at home and win support abroad by pulling in the U.S. You know, it's the superpower at the time, and pulling in the UK because of the historical connections between South Africa and the United Kingdom.
Why the title Selling Apartheid?
Well, I thought as I was writing this, it occurred to me that the people who were doing this on their behalf were selling an ideology the way that you sell soap, or that you sell Coca-Cola, or that you sell, you know, a product. And so that's basically what they did. They were selling this ideology to people that, you know, this is a good thing. We're anti-communist, we're this white government, and that these communist blacks are trying to overthrow us. And if they do, then the Soviet Union will have access to all these minerals and strategic location here at the tip of the African continent. So, you know, it was just, that's why they hired these public relations firms and marketing firms, was to sell this, and the people sold it just like it was any other product.
What sparked the interest for you to write this book?
Well, I've been coming to South Africa for a number of years, and I've been teaching at Wits University for a few years. And, you know, I was aware of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, and particularly in college, you know, I was aware of it. I can't say that, you know, it was like overwhelmingly on my mind at the time, and so when I got here, I was talking to people about it, and so it's like, well, what would be a new or a fresher way to sort of look at this issue, both from here and from the United States. So that's what sort of sparked my interest. Just about the anti-apartheid, I didn't set out to really write a book about the lobbying or the selling the apartheid, but it turned out that way the more that I researched.
Why do you think this was such a high degree of collaboration between the apartheid government and the United States government?
I think, again, the South African government presented itself as anti-communist. South Africa had strategic minerals that the United States needed. And so, and there were just, you know, some of the people in the book that I quote, there was also this sort of understanding, like, you know, if we were surrounded by all of these hostile blacks, we would probably do the same thing. And because you remember at the time that the national government came to power, the United States and all the other colonial powers in Europe were pretty much the same. I mean, blacks were treated pretty much the same in the United States as they were here. So it was sort of a natural affinity. You know, it was a white government on a predominantly black continent, and that they felt like, you know, and it was also the height of the Cold War, or the beginnings of the Cold War, rather. And so it was both race and communist, you know, opposition to communism.
You also interviewed many South African ministers while trying to unpack some information. Who would you say was the most interesting to speak to?
I think the Louis Nel, who was the former deputy foreign minister, was very forthcoming. I'd emailed him, and he emailed me back and said, "Hey, you know, sure, I'll talk to you." And, you know, he just talked. And so I was a little surprised, I guess. But, you know, I didn't really expect people to talk. I mean, he was like the only former minister to talk. There were other people who like John Chettle, who was part of the South African Foundation, that represented the business community in their opposition to sanctions. He spoke, but I was shocked that anybody from the apartheid government would have spoken to me.
Since you have been based in the country, do you think South Africans are liberated now?
Liberated in what sense? Liberated in terms of apartheid being over? I mean, obviously apartheid is over in terms of legal sense. I think just like in the U.S. with segregation being ruled illegal, there's still remnants and impacts of that ideology that exists in South Africa.
How do you compare the discriminated treatment of African Americans and Black South Africans under?
You know, I think it's similar, a lot similar in that, like you'll notice currently in the U.S. that there are fights over removing statues to like historical figures who were part of the government that tried to succeed from the U.S., the Confederate government. Just like you have fights here about the Statue of Rhodes and naming streets and buildings and things after, you know, people who were apartheid leaders. You know, those fights are still going on in the U.S. and slavery's been over since 1865. And so, you know, there are a lot of parallels between, you know, blacks here and blacks in the U.S.
Did you encounter any challenges while you were trying to write the book?
Well, yeah, quite a few actually. I mean, the records aren't in one place, and so I went to archives here, archives in the U.S., archives in the U.K. Some records have been destroyed. You know, people will tell you one thing that's not true, and then you report it and you find out that that's not what they told you is not true, and then you confront them again and they're like, okay, well that's true, but then they tell you something else. So yeah, it was a lot of going back and forth and trying to get records, and in some cases you couldn't get any records because they've been destroyed.
What can you say about the state of our government now when looking back on what people like Govan Mbeki or even Nelson Mandela envisioned South Africa to become?
I mean, it's hard to say because, you know, I'm not South African, and I don't really, I mean, I follow the politics here. I never really want to comment on, you know, a country not living here full time. I will say that this is what the folks who founded the ANC, I'm sure this is what they envisioned in terms of blacks being able to do whatever anyone else could do. That certainly was one of their dreams, that, you know, they wouldn't have to live in segregated societies, or that your opportunities wouldn't be limited by your color. You know, as far as the current situation, you know, it's hard to say what they would say about, you know, some of the other issues that the country is dealing with.
That was Washington correspondent for the New York Times and author Ron Nixon speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about his latest book titled Selling Apartheid.